So just before we go to tea break, we've got a short film from Helen, Dr. Helen Bodycomb from Man's in Australia, whose book you can buy at the back, Mosaicism. And it is a slight departure in books. I don't know if you've had a chance to have a look at it. It's not a project book or anything. It's more about the thought or the process of creativity. I really recommend having a look at it. You can buy it at the back, but she's just going to introduce it here and tell you a little bit more about it.
I'm Helen Bodycomb, and I'm the author of Mosaicism. It's a small book about the philosophy of making, particularly the philosophy of making using what I would call thinking in mosaic. And so it's about appraising materials and how and why we make, and time and materiality a little bit differently. And I've been working with my colleague Carolina Zanelli, who has kindly translated it into Italian, so it's a bilingual text, an illustrated text, which explores the history of mosaic, the practice of making as an intuitive act, particularly when it comes to bringing many, many small pieces together in order to create some kind of logic, whether it's a picture or a pattern. And so there's a very long history of this that probably goes right back to our early ancestors, but it's become a cultural practice, and it's one which I, as a contemporary artist, practice. So if we think a bit differently about the history of making and the history and the future of materials that we work with, it helps us to work through a different lens, and that's what Mosaicism is about. I think Mosaicism will be of interest to people who are interested in mosaic, who are making mosaic, who are teaching mosaic, but who are also working in other areas of design or making.
Some parts are very, very poetic, I would say. So it's a different way to see mosaic and the history of the materials that should let you also appreciate more what you have in your hands. The process, the language, not using mosaic as an art technique like any other one, like painting or sculpture. So we suffer a bit of this idea that mosaic is not as considered as much as other art techniques. And we are sort of fighting for this.
It's just a contribution to thinking and feeling about what we do. The book is about life, but a lot of it actually is couched as much within a sort of memento mori, remember death, remember the shortness, the brevity of everything. It's really about impermanence in a lot of ways. And I just want to say too that I was very fortunate to have an invited residency at Varuna, the National Writers' House, where I was able to really get into the sort of distillation from my thesis of the key ideas and write a range of new creative pieces which are part of the framework of Mosaicism. And Regional Arts Victoria also helped me with a small grant to get there as well. I just want to acknowledge them too, so thank you.
I start the book with a chapter, just a short story really, called Action and Object You Make Special. You are a small child again. It is a warm day and you're sitting legs outstretched on a narrow path. Head down, you're lost in another world. Around you lies a carpet of fallen leaves, a gradated spectrum of orange, red and green fragments dropped randomly through speckled light from the radiating branches above. Some are intact, perfect specimens. Others have been gnawed by insects or deformed in patterns by tiny parasitic intrusions. These lumps and bumps, spaces where there used to be leaf, undulations in colour and texture have enthralled you. You are busy now, compulsively, methodically arranging these leaves. One by one you position them, grouping them in zigzags or perhaps a radiating circle, linking colours and textures to make patterns and pictures. Some leaves are people. You build your family and even something resembling the family dog. It's perfect this warm day and its swirling altar world of colourful, leafy loveliness. This growing arcing pattern, this reality is everything until a sudden autumnal gust lifts every leaf as you watch open-mouthed and helpless, and in a fleeting moment, every leaf flutters across the grass to be deposited in a chaotic, involuntary pile under a shrub. Compost. Perhaps this was your very first mosaic, or maybe you were already in the habit of making this kind of thing because it feels good to do it. This process of arranging nature's detritus into shapes that we find pleasing or meaningful is primal and ancient. We may not understand exactly why we like to make them, but American anthropologist Ellen calls this type of activity making special. Personally, I love that phrase, particularly because special is one of my favourite words from childhood. Anything Mum said would be special was. So Dissanayake describes making special as being at the biological core of art, the stain that is deeply dyed in the behavioural marrow of humans everywhere. And she connects this type of play and ritual with our very survival as a species. While that is a fascinating theory, the act of making mosaic is much more than that. Manually building a whole through the repetition of many small units is, as we've seen, a deeply meditative means to create a thing, an artefact. For some, like you, the child, sitting hunched on a warm path, the fuzzy pheromones released through this act of making is motivation enough. For others, this act of making is just a means to an end, a route to the completion of an object. The end result, the mosaic, might be decorative or functional, conceptual, perhaps religious or esoteric. In these ways, mosaic can therefore be both a process, a verb, an action, and an artefact resulting from that process, that is a noun or an object. And both action and object beckon greater inquiry. The answers as to why and how we make mosaic, and for whom and for how long they might last, are different in every instance. And I'll explore some of them later in the book. From the millennia-old Hellenic mosaics that have survived wars, tectonic events and chemical attacks, to mosaics made with the intention, or at least the understanding, that they're not materially permanent. Like the leaves on the path, mosaics that remain only as memory of an idea swept away in a moment by an unseen zephyr, because wind is only visible when you can see what it carries.
Beautiful.